the first thing I did was to use a rotavator, because I grew up on a farm 6 miles from here in South Somerset, and I was wanting to bring health, bring health to people. So organic growing and nutrition is what interested me from the beginning. And then I was thinking, well, how am I going to get this to more people? And so I became an organic market gardener. And my research for that was not going to a college, thank goodness, where I would have had my head filled with lots of rules. But I just went around organic market gardens in 1982, looking at what they were doing and how they were managing. And the thing I saw more than anything was weeds. And in that sense, I'm quite traditional. You know, I know people talk about, oh, biodiversity, you've got to have some weeds on your plot. I don't agree with that. Not in the plot. You can have loads of wildlife around. But what these people were doing was they had a lot of weeds, and they were coping with that as best they could using a rotavator mostly. There was a lot of rotavating going on in the 1980s in organic market gardening, like I did to start with, because I didn't know any other way. And then I shaped up beds using a spade, and that's when from there I went no dig. But what struck me about that was, you know, organic, it's all above ground, and what happens, and nobody at that time that I was aware of, well, not nobody, but very few people were looking at what happens below ground and in the soil, and that's invisible out of sight. And to a large extent, that still happens. And, you know, when people talk about wildlife, they're talking about what they can see. And, you know, they'll dig away merrily and not consider how much that's interrupting wildlife. And there is a lot of evidence now that we are disturbing a lot when we cultivate soil in any way. So I've been inspired by coming across no diggers like Ruth Stout in the US, who used a lot of hay mulch, and I copied her because I didn't know any other better way to do it. And in my first year, I put down a lot of old hay to keep the weeds down, because I was worried that weeds were going to be my main problem, like I've seen everybody else battling with weeds. And what I didn't realize at that time was how no dig really reduces the weed growth. And so many other people now comment on that when they start no dig. And why is that? It's a combination of the compost mulch, but it's more than that. It's when, as I see it, when soil is disturbed, it reacts to heal itself. If you think of that word disturb means damaged, upset. And you can apply that word to any organism which is disturbed. How does it heal itself? It needs to heal, and different organisms have different methods. And for me, the soil is an organism, heals itself with weeds. And in fact, farmers in this part of the world do have a saying. They say, chickweed follows the rotavator, but they're not realizing really what they're saying. They're just noticing that that's what happens. And I had experience of that when I grew an acre of carrots in 1987, trying to meet the shortage of organic carrots in those days. And I did use a rotavator again, because I had a spare bit of ground I'd grown wheat on the year before. Didn't have time to make no-dig beds. I thought I'd rotivate it and then get the carrots drilled. And lo and behold, I got a massive chickweed, and we hoed that large area of ground 3 times, but the spring was damp, and every time the chickweed regrew, and we never harvested a single carrot from that patch. So that taught me quite a lesson there, and made me realize how, you know, this whole process is a natural process. Weeds don't happen by accident, they're a reaction. There's 1 or 2 exceptions I must quickly mention, is perennials like bindweed and mare's tail. You know, they do kind of happen, well, not exactly by accident, but they're there anyway. And however, with no dig, you can get rid of them. We're getting rid of bindweed now at this very moment through 2 summers of both mulching and also regular removal. It doesn't happen by chance. You've got to keep at it. And I find with all perennial weeds, if you keep at them, the parent root eventually gives up. So you can win that one, and it gives up 100%, and that's the big time saver. For me, the key to all this, well, one key to all this is time. You know, all of us as gardeners, I hear this so much, we have limited time. We can't afford to be messing around doing things that cost us time, or just go on taking more time, like the way that it's traditionally advised to deal with weeds. It's just a blooming time waster. So that's where I don't go, and that's why I think my work has mostly met a favourable reception, but I'm still puzzled why not more, to be honest, because the evidence is really strong that no dig saves you in so many ways. It saves you and it saves the environment. Therefore, you know, why aren't more people jumping on board? Why aren't the BBC actively promoting it on Garden as well, for example? From what I hear, I don't have television actually, but from what I hear, they mention it from time to time, and then in the next episode, it'll sort of get contradicted. It seems a bit half-hearted to me. Why? I don't know. But all I can say is I'm working from the bottom up through social media and events like this to reach an audience and show how it can work. So shall we dive into the slideshow, Jonathan, please? So if we go back to the beginning, first slide sums it up really. No dig. Long-term fertility, you know, that's through not disturbing the soil. You don't need to keep replacing a lot of fertility because you never lost it before. And so much advice in gardening and farming is based on hidden assumptions. And in this case, things like rotation, you know, it's based on soil being damaged, therefore you've got to have remedies. So let's get into the next slide. And this actually is a bit low res, this one. It gives you an idea of layout. This is actually my 3-strip trial, which I set up in 4 quite small beds. And you can see this one actually on a video we're releasing in about 3 days' time, where I'm answering what I call the compost question. And people say to me, oh, I couldn't do no dig because I can't get hold of all that compost. And that's a complete misunderstanding, because actually with no dig, you need less compost than if you're cultivating soil, losing carbon to the atmosphere, messing things up, and then you've got to heal all the damage. The ongoing amount of compost I use on these beds, for example, is about 1 inch a year. I slightly hesitate there because it's a question of how you measure it. And when you put it on, it might look like 2 inches because it's all flapped up, but that's not a true depth. And then you look at it a week later after it's been rained on, saying that it's about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters. That's our sum application of fertility, total application of fertility in 1 year for 2 crops. All of those beds grow 2 crops a year. Currently, they're growing their second crops, which include things like Brussels sprouts, cabbage, what people call heavy feeders. That term goes out the window when you go no dig, because all plants need food, and the soil supplies it according to the interactions it receives through the plant roots and the meeting of them with the soil network, the mycorrhizal fungi, for example, who organize food and moisture as well. You don't need to worry about that. What you need to do as a gardener is just feed your soil. That's an old saying, and strictly speaking, what it means is feed your soil life. And so you're putting food on the surface, which is how it works in nature. But okay, in nature, you don't walk through a forest and find a bed of carrots. Yeah, so this is where vegetable gardening gets a bit more complicated. It's not totally a natural process in that you need clean soil, for example, to sow carrots into. They're not going to come up if you sow them into a green manure cover crop of mustard, for example, where there'll be quite a few slugs and they'll struggle to get visible. You've got to be organized in that way. You've got to have bare beds. It's not bare soil, it's empty of growing food in certain beds ready by spring. This is another myth, and regenerative agriculture is taking over the mantle. I'm going to say some things that you might find controversial here, but I've gone beyond mincing my words at the age I am. You know, I've got enough experience to know what I'm saying. And I've seen permaculture confuse so many people. I hear that a lot. And it's not the fault of permaculture or anyone in it, really. It's just a vague term. What does it mean? And so a lot of people will say things that are permaculture, and actually it's just their version of what they think works, and not even often that they've done it, you know. So then I feel regenerative is the next sort of overall mantle word that has so many great but very vague meanings that, again, I feel are confusing people. And I hear this thing about cover cropping, which actually makes more sense for farming than gardening. I think we need a strong differentiation between what we do in gardening and what happens on farms. And if we haven't got that clear line of sight, we're going to get these misunderstandings. And so if you hear regenerative farmers talking, don't necessarily apply their methods to your gardens. Or if you're a farmer listening to this, don't necessarily apply my methods to your farm. I am here growing intensive vegetables. I'm cropping over 25,000 pounds worth of food from 1/3 of an acre this year, for example. That does not happen on a farm, not that value of output. And therefore, in a garden scale, doing that kind of thing, you can afford to, for example, apply compost, which you can't afford to do in this manner on a farm. We're not applying compost to the whole surface area. We're applying it to beds only, which is about 2/3, and the other third is pathways, which receive some wood chip, about the same depth, about 1 inch. I prefer to use old wood chip, again, once a year. So all the prep work is done in the winter, usually before Christmas. You're ready then for spring. There's a few caveats, like those beds on the right in the middle, that's actually mustard. And there I have sown a cover crop because I happened to have a bit of ground that wasn't growing vegetables. On the 1st of October, sowed some mustard. And that's a nice one, green mustard, sorry, white mustard, Synaptis arbor, because it's killed by frost. The joy of no dig there. You know, I wouldn't have sown grazing rye or ryegrass because, well, you could, but you're going to lose time in the spring. That bed was subsequently transplanted up with spinach on the 17th of March. I'd have been struggling to get any kind of ryegrass or cover crop of a non-frost destroyed type to have got rid of it by 17th of March, and with no slug residue either. So next slide, please. There you can see ongoing, and in fact that area that we had in the previous slide is now bottom right, and you can see how it's progressed through the spring. And this is the current year actually, because we can see the application of black plastic, top left, black polythene. I actually use very little plastic. I don't find it necessary because weeds are not a problem. In the main area there, which is garden created since the previous year, there are very few weeds. You don't need plastic, full stop. Membranes, no, nothing like that. Not even cardboard. The cardboard only goes down if you've got a lot of weeds in year 1. That's it. No more cardboard. I struggle to get that one across because I've never said that, but I think people assume it, and probably because they've not been quite on it enough with weeds. You know, you still got a weed with no dig. But when you get disciplined about it and do it regularly, little and often, and tackle the weeds when they're very small, you end up doing very little weeding. On that big square area, bottom left, we do about 15 minutes weeding a week, I would say, through the season. 15 minutes, you know, that's a fifth of an acre or something. But we do spend quite a bit of time edging, so keeping the grass from invading, and that takes time. So, you know, we're on the maintenance where appropriate. The plastic is on a new area which has a lot of bindweed, and that's mainly why I'm using plastic there. And so that's occasional use, and then we'll remove it after the crop, which is now got in it, of growing squash and sweet corn and potatoes. Potatoes harvested. And then once the squash are off, we'll clear all the debris to compost heap and roll out the plastic, and we can use it again. So it's not a one-off, one-use plastic. Okay, next slide. You can also see my pond in that one, the pond which subsequently dried up. Yeah, so this is a summary of the process, the annual process, and you can see the layout, or one example of layout. Those are quite narrow beds there on the right, and that's one. I'm trying lots of different things all the time. You know, my market garden is not like Jean Martin Fortier super efficient market garden. I've got different bed widths, different bed lengths, because I'm trying things, and also I do patchwork cropping. I prefer that. I find it more manageable. So it's quite rare actually that I'll plant, say, a 10-meter bed with just one vegetable. And because I don't do 4-year rotation, I don't need to. When I started organic growing, that was an absolute gospel that you had to do that. I don't know if you've ever wondered, why 4? And actually, it comes from the Earl of Townsend, Turnip Townsend farmer in Norfolk in the 1780s, who improved the medieval 3-year rotation of wheat, barley and fallow, and he added a year of turnips and clover and brought sheep into grazing one of those years. And then you think, well, how does that fit into gardening? I still don't get that one. And you know, people have managed to sort of cobble it together. But what I found is that with healthy soil from no dig, plants thrive, and you don't need to worry about rotation. We'll see in a minute. I'll give you some details. Okay. You'll also notice I don't have wooden sides, so that's a huge saving. You know, going back to that original question, you know, I couldn't afford to do no dig because I couldn't afford the compost. And then these same people, quite often, they're putting in expensive wooden sides to beds. Why? You know, it's like, excuse me, really, why? I'd encourage all of you, most of you, maybe you've got the answers already, but if you haven't, ask questions. You know, don't make assumptions about anything. And if you see anyone doing anything, don't accept that it necessarily needs to be done by you. you know, we can all be different. I think there's a strong version of herd mentality in human beings that we all need to be super aware of. It's become very apparent in COVID and a lot of things like that recently, and the media whip it up. And, you know, like I said about the BBC, you know, be careful where you get your sources of information from. And I trust very few people, and I'm always questioning, what are your assumptions? A lot of assumptions are to do with digging. There are people assuming you dug, therefore you need to rotate. They're assuming you dug, therefore you can't walk on your beds. There's another one. We walk on the beds, that's fine, because they have a firm structure. Not that deliberately walking on the beds. I've got pathways, and mainly we don't walk on the beds because they're intensively cropped and you just physically can't walk through them. But if you need to put a foot on the bed to reach the middle or anything like that, totally fine. Okay, next slide shows some mustard on the left. Again, cover crop, and that will be killed by frost. And the word cover, I think, is what's confusing in terms of this regenerative thing, because the cover can be compost. You know, it doesn't have to be something growing. And also you can cover with compost underneath growing plants. So like Brussels sprouts on the right, for example, because I encourage always removing the lower leaves. That stops yellowing leaves falling on the ground, and then you get slug buildup. So slugs for me is a proactive thing, not have habitat. And occasionally you might need to go out at night with a torch to reduce their population. So I'm not just sitting back, but I'm you know, the whole thing with pests is be prepared, know your pests, and don't wait for them to ravage your crops. If you know you've got pigeons, you've got to use some netting over your brassicas, for example. Here we have, I know that we have pigeons, but only in December. So in these photos, for example, in the middle of the right-hand photograph, you can see there's uncovered cabbages, and they're not netted in any way. They have a mesh cover over them when they're planted. So in summer, we're transplanting small brassica plants, second crops mostly, after broad beans or peas or beetroot or carrots. And that's when they need protection. And we'll keep a mesh cover on for, say, 6 weeks or so, and then remove it, and then we get our summer growth. When the plants get bigger, it's much easier not to have a cover on. I have pigeons here in December, so I know that I've got to put some bird netting structure over them then. This is an example of first and second cropping. Succession cropping with no new compost added in the summer is very simple with no dig. So there's also a no rotation aspect to this one, which is the broad beans and potatoes in this photo are in their 6th year, and then in the same place, and they're followed by cabbage and leeks every year. We're just finishing or in the middle of the 8th year, and the road's still going very well. Okay, next picture. So starting out, no dig. And this is where I recommend using more compost, but you can do it with less. There I was using 5-6 inches, 12-15 centimeter. Although again, probably less by the time it has settled. And you may be wondering, well, there's no cardboard under the compost in the bed, but there is in the pathways. And the answer for that question is I'd run out of cardboard, and I was prioritizing it for pathways because I'm as keen to get the pathways clear of weeds in the beginning as I am the beds. And then I can remove the temporary wooden sides, and you haven't got any weeds creeping in from your path. So look after your pathways, get them weed free, and then feed the path soil with, you can put a bit of compost on it first if you want. I've done that sometimes. Or wood chip, well-rotted wood chip is good because it's got more fertility in, but don't put it on too thickly. And then you'll have a fertile soil in your pathway that your plants can root into and find moisture. And we've seen that a lot this summer in the dry conditions of plants on the edges of beds are bigger than the ones in the middle. Okay, next picture. So a bed like that one that I was making, it's now the first long bed coming up to a point just in the middle of the photograph near the camera. And that bed had a lot of creeping thistle in at this end. And I've heard a lot of people say they struggle to get rid of that. All I can say is there, you know, it was vigorous. Regular removal, it gives up. These perennial weeds, they're not invincible. I think people give them too much slack. I think they feel too daunted by them. Feel free to disagree, but I found that with creeping thistle, if you get your finger under the prickly bit, I'm talking creeping thistle here, by the way, not the annual sow thistle or other types of thistle that grow from seed, the perennial one, with a long white root that you'll never see, but you get your hand under the creeping bit the thistly bit and you're onto the white bit of regrowth of root, you can pull it and get out a good 4 inches, put that on the compost heap, no problem. And that already weakens it. Keep doing that for 3 months. Okay, might sound a lot. For me, that's a lot less than battling with it every year. It then disappears. So I'm committing, I'm putting time investment in at the beginning. In the first year, I was doing a lot of buttercup removal there as well, dandelions. But nonetheless, within 4 months, I was getting crops, I was getting harvests, I was making money in market garden, or if it was home use, you'll be getting value from your food very quickly. That will help to pay for the compost. Next picture. And then this is a stabilized garden, you could call it. This is garden in about 6th, 7th year of cropping. You know, mature, it's nice. And it's exactly as I've described. There's no wooden slides. Pathway is quite narrow. My favorite bed width and path width is 1.2 meters, 4 foot for beds, and 40 centimeters, 16 inches for pathways. And you can see that's not, it looks a wide enough pathway at the beginning of the year. By late summer, autumn, like with the Swedes in the foreground, you can get quite a lot of leaves regrow or growing over the pathway. That's totally fine. You know, they're making use of all that sunlight. You know, this is a very efficient way to use space and to get more carbon into the soil, because you're using all the space to grow food all the time. And the thing about succession planting, we're never leaving beds empty. We do it really fast in the summer because with no dig, there's so little bed prep. You haven't got to prepare soil in any way. And you haven't got to worry about heavy feeders and light feeders. You know, just plant what you want, where you want, wherever you see a space. That's pretty much how I do it. Like I say, I'm not worrying about rotation. I don't really have a plan for my second cropping. I've got ideas. Like there's certain things go well. For example, broad bean followed by lettuce or cabbage, potatoes followed by leeks, and so on. You know, one can make quite a list. You'll find out things. It depends what you want to grow. You know, and there's no point in growing any of that if you don't like to eat it. So you need to first of all decide what you want to eat, find out its main season of growth, and I would say whether it's an early cropper or a late cropper. All vegetables grow, not quite all actually, 90% though of what we grow is in half a season, which is one aspect where 4-year rotation really messes up in my view, because they talk about whole seasons. You know, so what do you do in the second half of the season? Do you grow more cabbage? Say if your early cabbage is finished, you plant more cabbage. What you can do, you know, in my view, I prefer to actually mix it up even more than that, and I'll grow something different in the second half of the year. But it's not strict, it's not rigid in any way. It's where I see a space. Okay, next. And then we get a lot of fungi in the soil. I love this, and that's the fruiting body there. I'm not too sure of the name of this. There's many versions. Fungi is a fascinating thing that the guy I work with here, I've got one full-time helper, Adam, he's really good on fungi, and he was telling me the other day how all the terminology and the nomenclature has changed a lot in recent years as people discover with microscopes, I think, you know, more of what's going on under the soil surface. And it really shows how little we know. When I started growing in the early 80s, I was reading things like by scientists in reports, vegetables do not use the mycorrhizal network, you know. That was it, statement, black and white. And I was really disappointed because it made sense to me that why shouldn't they? And you know, they were saying only woody plants and trees use the mycorrhizal network. Anyway, of course, that's changed now. And I use that statement actually as an example of how we need to be careful of listening to scientists or people who call them scientists. Just because they're scientists doesn't mean they know everything. It's a dangerous word in the way it's used currently. And you know that saying we had at the beginning of COVID, follow the science. Well, excuse me, what is that? Please define. And who is the scientist who's going to say what is the science even? You know, that's a judgment, that's a value judgment. There's loads of hidden assumptions in all of that. And so with gardening, yeah, follow your nose, see what works. And I've never seen any written reference to all this lovely white stuff in the soil, and it smells of forest flora and mushrooms. It's gorgeous, and plants love it. There's still a lot more to discover about it. Next picture. There's a close-up of some woody material in the soil. This is a reason why actually I never sieve compost. I'm very happy to put woody bits in. That's not how I understood it in the 80s when I began. And everyone using compost then, as far as I can see anyway, they were sieving it or using very fine compost, and the finer the better. And now, you know, with these new understandings, one can see the value of actually keep putting a bit more wood in the compost heap, so it's there in the first place, high fungal activity, and then when you spread it on the soil, we got some lovely black fine stuff, and we got woody bits on the surface doing this. For me, that's all beneficial. There's very few fungi that are harmful. Okay, next. Yeah, weeds. So this is how I deal with bindweed, and I use the trowel, not especially deep, maybe 3-4 inches up to 10 centimeters, to lever out as much of the new growth. You very rarely get the parent root, which is going quite deep, but that parent root does not have unlimited energy. You know, that would be in the world of magic if that was the case. And unfortunately, that's how it's presented to people, as though bindweed is indeed magic and will always come to plague you, whatever you do. I found that you can get rid of it, basically, by regular removal like this. You can also put it on your compost heap. That's another common saying that's so wrong. So there you can see we've done a big bindweed insertion. That's the compost heap on the right, and how much bindweed root as well as the top we've put on. And all I can say is they disappear. And that includes compost heaps that are not necessarily hot. I've done this in winter sometimes when the heaps don't go above 30, 35 centigrade, just because those roots are not invincible. You know, so this is where gardeners are being misled by people who claim to know, including the RHS in some cases, and they don't know because they haven't tried it any other way. They just believe what they were told. You know, where do these things come from? Who originated a lot of the things you've heard? You know, who had the idea to bring foliar rotation into gardening? But that links to how you look after the soil. So with no dig and surface application of organic matter, you can go a long way to just making things much simpler. Next picture. Just to put a time on that, by the way, I didn't say with bindweed, we find 2 years. My first year here, 2013, at Homemakers, I had a lot of bindweed in the area. You can see just above those compost heaps, actually. So this side of the greenhouse. And I spent a lot of time that first summer removing the growth. And, you know, I got quite downhearted at times doing that. I felt I was doing the right thing. 2014, it came back and I was at it again. And suddenly by September that year, it almost pretty well stopped. And now then it was just coming in from the edge a bit. So we're still patrolling the edges. It's in the grass nearby. We keep the grass short, that weakens the perennial weeds that are growing in the grass. So mown grass near your plot is a good idea, not tall grass. That will spread in more both by root and by seed. And also that will reduce the incidence of slugs to keep your edges tidy. And then making compost, that's such a key thing. Whether you dig or no dig, you need to make compost. You know, unless you're going to use artificial fertilizer, you need compost. In fact, I would say you need 10% more compost if you're digging. That's the result from my trial beds where I got 2 beds side by side. So compost you make as much as you can. We scrounge materials. Like I've trained up my neighbours to bring any waste materials if they've got one they can deal with. For example, we'll go out of the lane. I've discovered a lovely pile of browns, mostly sort of woody material, which some of the neighbours have been dropping there in a little sort of lay-by on the lane, and just out of sight, out of mind. And we brought it back with a wheelbarrow, and because it was quite brown and woody, and we run a lawnmower over it. When I say we, it's Adam or me, or mainly Adam. And that chops it up. A lawnmower is a brilliant shredder, mobile shredder, and turns it in small pieces. Great way to deal with bramble roots, for example. You know, with brambles, there are a lot of brambles here where I put these compost heaps. If you've seen that picture, well, you couldn't have really seen it 6 months earlier because there was a tall fence. This is just the other side of the new land I bought. This was the edge of Homemakers door. It's totally overgrown with weeds, which is my wild area. You know, I don't want wild areas in my vegetable plot, but I'm very happy to have them around the edge after I got a mown strip just literally close to the cropped area. So yeah, wildlife is good in the right place. And these compost heaps are working really well. I just love them because they're simple, they're cheap, they're quick, they're effective. They were placed on ultra weeding ground, bindweed, couch grass, thistles, nettles, the brambles we've removed. And underneath the ingredients and materials we add to these heaps, there's no cardboard. The cardboard is just around the edge. You don't need cardboard under the compost itself because the compost material you put in sorts out the weeds. You know, again, bindweed's not invincible. It can't grow through a heap, especially when it's warm. It just can't. These heaps do get warm. I'm avoiding the word hot because I don't want to give you that impression. They'll go up to 55, 60 degrees centigrade briefly after we add a lot of green. And they hold it enough time actually to kill most weed seeds, but they don't stay hot for long. And I think that's a strength compared to my bigger heaps, my bigger bays, which stay hot for longer. Still making great compost, but for me, this is the ultimate actually. And the method we use is we fill like the first bay on the left, and we've knocked the bottoms off the pallets and we put 2 wires on the corners. Again, ultra simple, quick and cheap. To get access to it, when you want to turn these heaps, you just undo a couple of wires and swing the gate open, so to speak. So we fill the first one, then we fill the one on the end. We don't fill the middle one with fresh material ever. That just receives turned ingredients from the 2 outer bays. That way you get 4 heaps out of 3 because of the way compost settles as it rots down. We can fill one of these bays in 2 months. Every garden will be different. You might not. You might fill it in a month, you might fill it in 4 months. You need to then tailor your methods, exact methods, according to how much material you can get hold of and how long it takes to fill your heaps. So I'm just giving you guidelines here and explaining what works for us and how it works. And then the corrugated iron you can see on the right is, if it's raining a lot, the advantage of that is it's keeping rain off the finished compost, which is the far heap in this case has a heap material that's been added to until it was full, and now it's waiting to be turned, and the middle one has material that's been turned and is almost compost. Next picture shows you that in more detail. No, it doesn't. No, I think these were the wrong way around. I'm sorry about that. This was the first bay, and what's happening here is also an interesting thing. You see how I've lined it with cardboard, and again, this contradicts what you would have heard. It's almost like gospel in the composting world. You've got to have slatted sides to let in the air. No. It doesn't work like that. I mean, again, if a bit of brain power will tell you that can't be right. Otherwise, your heat will be drying out and cooling down all the time. So actually, solid sides are better. We're using pallets just because they're free. But if I had a solid side, I'd be very happy to use that. And if you look at my larger composting area in the background there, you can see the sides are indeed solid. I'm using planks of Douglas fir, for example, that we screw and unscrew. So the cardboard's brilliant as an insulator and moisture retainer. Okay, next picture. So this was 6 months later only, and it's the middle bay which has now received the material from the first bay, which started in April, finished in May, and the second bay, which started in June, finished in July. So this compost is on average 3 or 4 months old, and it's just gorgeous. And when we opened up the pallet, we found loads of wildlife like toads, mice. There wasn't a rat as it happens, but I don't mind rats too much in the compost heap. They do a great job of aeration, for example. And there was, well, lots of woody bits, as you can see, lots of air holes, just full teeming with life. So there you are. Okay. And then often at the turning stage, we'll find worms. These worms are Yersinia foetida, brindley worms, red worms, tiger worms, all the same thing. And they're the ones that decompose material. That's not the same as earthworms, which are pink ones, Lumbricus terrestris. And that's compost that, again, that's not very old. It's about 3 months old, and that's made in the winter. And that subsequently turned into really nice compost, which I'm planning to use more in potting because it's so of that quality. Got lots of ideas for making potting compost. Okay, next. And there are the heaps in the ongoing stage. And just to the left, we've got a pile of wood chip, which we've mixed with grass mowings, just to see if that can speed up the decomposition of the wood chip, which it is. But there's still large pieces of wood chip. Wood chip is a big subject. Do check out my video on YouTube about that if you haven't seen it already, because there's more than I can cover here. But if you want wood chip for your plot or your garden, now is the time. Tree surgeons have done a lot of pruning and are doing a lot of pruning of new growth of wood, summer wood, spring and summer wood, which is otherwise called green wood, as opposed to logs, old wood. If they ever have to chip a tree, a whole tree, that's the kind of wood chippings you don't want. And I got a pile of them by mistake. It was poplar, and I looked at some of those chips. They're big as well. I could have almost have put them in my wood burner, but they're in the wood chip pile. So we got some of those in there. And what we're going to do, we're going to use that as compost, but we will need to sieve that one. I never sieve my compost heaps, but that wood chip pile, which is half rotted, we're sieving it. And I've got a A 45-degree sieve, you can get them, I can't remember the link, but there's a website that sells them. If you put in a 12mm 45-degree metal sieve, it'll probably come up actually. And it's like a bed frame. We used to do a bed frame in the 1980s, propped up at 45 degrees. You throw stuff at it and the big stuff falls down the front and the fine stuff goes through. So much easier than using a handheld sieve. And in the middle bay there, you can see cardboard on top, which we use as just an insulator and moisture retainer when the heap is finished and maturing. Okay. This is my main area of making compost, where the bays are almost 3 times as big. And there I'm spreading some material from the shredder, which is just out of picture, or almost in picture on the left. It's a Bosch AX25 TC, really good device, electric, so it's reasonably quiet. Does take quite a bit of time to feed through, but I would say worth it. And we've got a lot of, normally, not this year so much because of the drought, but normally we got a lot of green material coming into the compost heap, and it's often quite wet as well. So it's very rare that we water the compost heap, but we have been this July and August. And we're adding to this green material things like shredded wood and green wood, like, or apple prunings. So that's just wood of last year. It's good stuff. That's what I'm spreading there. Okay. And then the heap turning. There's my son, Edward. So instead of going to the gym, I said, right, you can turn the compost heap. And yeah, he quite enjoyed it actually. And that took him about 2 hours. It's about 1.5 tons or so. And the advantage of doing that is, you know, why not just leave it alone? Well, you can, you know, there's no, I'm not giving you a rule that you have to turn a compost heap, but the benefits, if you can manage to do it, you get a much more even compost. You'll regain the time you spent turning it when you come to spread it, because it'll be so quick. That's what we find. And you've got a chance to distribute the contents more evenly. And you might find, for example, some dry pockets for whatever reason. And that's a chance to give a bit of moisture, so you can regularize the moisture levels of your compost heap during turning. And you can also, it's a fantastic opportunity to discover all those lost tools and kitchen knives and forks and everything like that. I'm terrible at flinging trowels into a compost heap with my weeds, but they always turn up in the end. Actually, it's a big advantage of those copper trowels that the copper doesn't rust. The handles do degrade a bit, it must be said. But anyway, that's turning. I do recommend it if you can find time. If you don't, then just don't beat yourself up. But you will find when you come to turn your compost, or spread it rather, it takes a bit longer and it won't be quite so even. Okay. We're making compost of a decent quality within 6 months on average, but there's no harm in waiting up to a year, which we're certainly doing at the moment. Just we made a lot last autumn and winter that we're not yet ready to use. So we're stockpiling compost at the moment, and all of us can do that. Again, people say, how do you need to have enough compost? It should be for gardening, for vegetable gardening in particular. Vegetables need fertile soil. That's what it's about. But the amount I'm advising you to use is not huge, in my view. And it's a lot less than people used to use in some of the old tutorials of 19th century gardening. There was one on YouTube, someone sent me a link to University of Nebraska, spreading 100 tons an acre a year of well-rotted horse manure. 100 tons an acre. I'm using around 40, I reckon, tons of compost. And I must just mention here, because this also gets massively misunderstood. People worry that compost, if you spread it in winter, is leaching its nutrients. Totally untrue. Not if it's decently made compost like this. That's the whole point of it. That's the whole point of composting. Well, not the whole point. It's one big reason. You're converting waste materials into a gold-like material, a very stable form and stable in every way, carbon and nutrient retention. The nutrients of water insoluble. If that wasn't the case, homemakers would not be working like it is. You know, that for me is like irrefutable, because I'm saying, I'm doing these 2 crops a year, often planting brassicas in summer after carrots, beetroot, you know, after a busy crop, even after brassicas preceding, and they grow lovely, beautiful dark green leaves, and they're well fed and everything like that. So this is where compost is like a gold mine. You're stocking up your soil with long-term fertility. You don't need to cover beds after spreading compost. The rain can wash through it, doesn't leach out the nutrients. Even farmers are getting into this now. I say that deliberately. Even they'd be skeptical about this, and they tend to look on compost, from my experience, as NPK, nutrient, you know, that kind of thing. And they're very aware of spreading too much slurry. That's now been enforced on them by the Environment Agency, because it's got soluble nitrates that leach into the water. Compost does not have that. That's why it's really unfair. At Sissinghurst, where there's a fantastic no-dig vegetable garden that I helped to set up, 10 years ago with Sarah Raven, and they're organic, certified soil association. Even the soil association were not defending them from the Ministry of the Environment, and they were limited in how much compost they could put on for growing vegetables. That to me was totally wrong, because for vegetables you do need more compost than you do if you're growing wheat or grass or whatever. Okay. These are my dig no dig trials that have taught me so much, and are ongoing because I just want to learn more. It's not to prove anything one way or the other. It does raise some interesting questions, and prove is the wrong word, because that long term, it's not a replicated trial anywhere else. It's just 2 beds, but it's got a lot of interesting pointers, indications. I was working with a scientist on it in 2021, and she buried cotton calico cloths in the no dig bed, that's the further tray, and in the dig bed, and to see how much they degrade. More microbial life in the no dig bed, the one at the back. The cotton had almost disappeared. However, then she realized, well, of course, they were mostly in the surface compost that I put on there. These beds have 2 wheelbarrowfuls of compost every year. That's a decent sized wheelbarrow, but that's all. And they're producing, the no dig bed produces on average over 9 years, 950 kilos, that's 105 kilos a year of food, 1.5 by 5 meters, 5 feet by 16 feet. Huge amount of food for 2 wheelbarrowfuls of compost. For me, that's incredibly reasonable. No other inputs, no feeds, fertilizers. I don't use any of that stuff. I don't use any slug pellets. I could even phrase it like, I hate that stuff. I've grown up in a world where it's been gospel to use it. I grew up on a chemical farm. I don't like the word conventional either, because that's too conventional. If you look at the word conventional in the dictionary, it's normal and natural. Hey, hang on a minute. These guys, they're not doing normal, natural things. It's us who are conventional, if you like, in that sense of the world. Anyway, right, next picture. So this trial, ongoing through the year, we plant up these beds, usually middle of March, from sowings made in the greenhouse in mid-February. That's my first sowing date, pretty much. Lights increasing, tiny bit of warmth, but we've obviously got the warmth of the greenhouse to get them going. We've got little seedlings, not big, as you can see. Those beds are fully planted, as you can, what you see on the left there. And that includes 2 lines of carrots, which I sow direct. They're the only thing going direct, and potatoes, which we put in using a trial. And they have intercrops between actually a radish and turnips. You can take a harvest while the potatoes are getting established. I'm doing a lot of things like that, making every bit of space count. And then after 44 days, already the no dig bed has stronger growth than many of the vegetables. Not all, but it's fascinating every year. That slightly varies. Next picture. That picture left, believe it or not, that's not spring anymore, that's summer. And that shows how we're taking so many harvests through June mostly, starting mid-May for some vegetables like the radish, turnip, spinach. And by late June, a lot of the bed is empty. And so we're doing new plantings like leeks after peas, I think it was there. It varies a bit every year. And in the front, there's Savoy cabbage, for example, after potatoes, and endive as well. So these are all June, July, new plantings, succession summer plantings, which go in. So you have a phase sometimes in the summer when it's looking a bit empty while the second crop's established. Okay. This is looking at these 2 beds, surface soil down to 10 centimeters, 4 inches, with a 400 magnification microscope. And the dig bed is on the left, where the interpretation of that by the microbiologist is you can see a lot of segregated bacteria. It looks pretty even, but what you're not seeing so much of is what you see on the photo on the right. In the no dig, you've got a lot of what's called aggregation, crumb structure. That's the thing that in soil gives you that lovely crumbly feeling if ever you dig it up. We're not, obviously, but that's what's down there. And that's what allows good drainage between the crumbs, good aeration, maintenance of aeration all the time, no slumping. Like, people who dig, well, okay, they've done it. Why have they got to dig again the following year? It's because it's all slumped down. They damage the structure. They've got to revive it, and well, revive is the wrong word, to get air into it somehow, temporarily. But they're losing the ability of soil to maintain its aggregation, if you like. Okay, next picture. This is again looking slightly more closely, and here we can see interesting things like, again, it's no dig on the left, very, very similar story. Little black dots, if you can see them black circles, that's spores of mycorrhizal fungi, so that's a good thing. We can see them even in the digs, so that's encouraging. In the no dig on the right, we got amoeba. That's that sort of lozenge-like shape, roughly in the middle. And to the right of that is a little cucumber-like shape, and that's a diatom, which is the basis of diatomaceous earth and silica-rich, and that's apparently a strong and good indication if you see that in your soil microscope work. It's fascinating what goes on down there. I'm no expert on this, but a lot of people like to have a look at these and make comparisons. Next picture. Just to learn. This is the results of doing this trial now for several years. You can see it's pretty consistent. The no-dig bed is ahead every year. The results vary a lot, and that's mainly with the weather. So 2017, for example, we had very favorable weather throughout. And in 2018, that was the last time we had a really hot, dry summer. This year, however, we're keeping up, and I think it might be that we're watering more. I've been, not afraid to water this year. I'm on the main. I'm thinking about getting a borehole. I probably am, actually, after the experience of this year. But I don't find it uneconomical because we're using handheld hose, no devices, except in the polytunnel, a bit of spray line, but not too much. We're putting the water where it counts, and it's not on the whole garden. But we do these beds quite a bit because I want to get them expressing to full potential. Okay. And that's this spring, just to bring you up to date. And there were one or two really interesting things here, like the onions. Look at the difference in the growth of multi-sown onions, sown at the same time, planted at the same time in March. Dig bed on the left, no dig bed on the right. What is all that about? I'm still not sure, but I think it's to do with moisture. In dry weather, I notice stronger differences. We're seeing it at the moment in Celeriac, very small on the dig bed and very strong and steady on the no dig bed. So certain vegetables express that more than others, and the peas behind were much poorer on the dig bed. You can see there compared to the no dig. The yield was something like 3 kilo and 5 kilo. So we're keeping record of all the harvest. Okay, next picture. Here's a nice example of interplanting. This sort of thing you can do with no dig that can massively raise your output and reduce the area you need to grow a certain amount of food. I get quite a few questions, and I had a couple this evening on social media. Both of them were about thistles, actually, by chance. But the nut of it is that people in distress can't keep up with the weeds. She said, I'm going through a no dig hell. And I said, well, just scale down. You're doing too much. Crop a smaller area more intensively. You've got to have an area of ground cropping that you can manage. If it's getting ahead of you, you're doing too much. You're not then going to enjoy it, and you're going to miss out on doing things that you could do, like this intensive bed of lovely carrots. That's only the first 1/3 of the year. Sown equinox, harvested through June and July. In this case, it's middle of June. We've harvested enough carrots to make a little hole to transplant Brussels sprouts. Okay, how can that work? The Brussels sprouts surely being overshadowed by carrot leaves. There's hardly any space for them to grow. Well, all I can say is they grow really well, as you can get a clue there in the right-hand photograph. I think there's mycorrhizal association here. I don't know of anyone who's looked at this kind of thing specifically. But what we're finding with interplants is, and actually some old farmers called them nurse crops. You could say the carrots there, they're a nurse crop for those Brussels sprouts. They're giving them shelter and kind of looking after them, little transplants. A bit like, you might have read that book, Mother Tree, by Professor Suzanne Simard in Canada. She's been a bit of a voice in the wilderness. She's about my age, early 60s. And I'm glad that people are really now paying attention to her and realizing, God, this really makes sense, all this mycorrhizal network and plants talking to each other. I don't yet know what my mother vegetable is, but I'm sure that all the plants in the garden, the vegetables, are talking to each other, not literally, but there's a communication there. And with no dig, you're really allowing it. And this is another reason why it works so well. Okay. And these Brussels, look at that. So this is no compost for a whole year. And we've had a heavy crop of carrots. Now we're getting fantastic growth of those Brussels. And that was compost that was put down before Christmas the previous year. The rain had washed through even before I sowed a carrot. This is why I say there's no nutrient loss here. No, the soil is holding on to it. The whole no dig network of life and production capacity is maintained, not at full throttle, but at potentially full throttle. The full throttle bit comes in summer when you've got sufficient warmth and moisture, and when you've got plant roots talking to the network and requesting something. Otherwise, I'm guessing it may be slightly dormant. And that's why it's good to have something growing all the time. For me, it wants to be vegetables. I don't want to grow a cover crop. You know, I want to eat something. So I'm following vegetable with vegetable all through the year. We don't often have ground empty of vegetables. And that's one reason I don't have much actual cover crop growing in the winter, because there's not time to establish it in the autumn. You know, yeah, okay, you could sow things in the winter, but they're not going to do much. They're not in our climate. You better save your seed, spread some compost, and then you've got a nice clean ground ready for sowing in the spring. And here we've spread compost already, so that's the ground is ready in the spring. By late March, Brussels more or less finished. We'll twist out the stumps, maybe transplant onions. That's what we did this year. 30th of March, after Brussels sprouts, transplanted multi-sown onions. They were harvested during July, beautiful crop of onions. So in the spring, there was no time lost spreading compost or getting the ground ready after twisting out the Brussels sprout. For example, leaving small roots in the ground, the big ones come out a bit. I walked on the beds to squash it down again. I don't want loose soil. I want it firm. Firm is not the same as compact. And then we transplanted the onions, and we're now about to transplant rocket and mustards in that very same bed. Again, without putting on any more compost, and that'll be autumn salads, which you could look at as a green manure. Supposing you plant more than you actually harvest, well, it's a green manure. Okay, next picture. Intersowing that and planting more nice examples. So carrots between lettuce. I find that works well with the lettuce. We're harvesting outer leaves every week. That makes space after a pick that you can actually get your hoe in there, or finger actually is what I use. Draw the line in the surface compost with the finger. It's nice and soft. Drop in the carrot seeds, fold over with your hand, give it a good water. On the right, that you don't need much watering. It's autumn, and I found that we're tidying up all brassicas of lower leaves, like I said, for the Brussels. Swedes, same. That means there's space to underplant, interplant with lamb's lettuce. So as you harvest the Swede, then you've got more lamb's lettuce. Okay. This is a nice one, which I've just done again this year, actually, although with transplants. So outdoor tomatoes, 10th of August, sowing. But if you've got spinach transplants, you could transplant them anytime towards the end of August under your tomatoes. You know, why wait for tomatoes to finish? You've got space there. I'm presuming you've de-leafed a bit, which is always good with tomatoes. Cut off the bottom trusses, which are finished, that you've got space to get at the ground. And so there we just very carefully cut the roots, surface roots of the tomato plant to remove it. Oh, within 2 weeks, we're picking spinach. Works really well. Again, I think that association helps. Okay. Yeah, this is no rotation. So years 5 and 6, and every year I do this, I have to almost fight myself a bit, because I grew up in the farming world. Rotation was assumed, thought, taught to be good. A good thing. How could it not be? I first questioned it when I came across Shumei people, actually, by chance, and they were based near Avebury, and they do something called natural farming, taught by a Japanese guy, not the same as Fukuoka. Anyway, I don't agree with a lot of their practice, because, for example, they use rotavator a lot. They certainly did when I came across them. Maybe they don't anymore, but at the time. But there was one thing they do, which is they call it continuous cropping, which I think is a nice phrase. And their understanding is that microbes in the soil are kind of used to certain plants. I'm not saying this means the same plant should go there forever, because I think there are other factors that do come into play. However, I'm curious to see maybe how long. So we're now literally in the 8th year. This was year 5 and 6. It's just to give you an idea of, yeah, pretty healthy so far. And the yields are consistent. The plant health stays really good. Okay. And I think no dig is to do with this. That was last year. Potatoes, 7th year, same bed. And pretty average yield, 42 kilograms. Charlotte. Lettuce, 5th year, same bed, 47 kilos. You know, what can you say? It's clearly working. And the next picture, I'm not sure if I got the 8th year in. Can we just quickly have a look? No, can we go back to that previous one? So I've now got a photo where it's the potatoes 8th year and the lettuce 6th year. And the yields were even higher. In the 8th year of potatoes in the same bed, we got 58 kilos. Lettuce, we got 62 kilos. What that reflects, actually, as much as anything, is a very favourable growing spring for potatoes and lettuce. And we managed to get enough water on. With potatoes, I don't water them until I see flowering. You know, the potatoes are starting to swell, so leave them be until then. That's why we don't use too much water. We're applying it very selectively by hand at certain periods of the plant's life, and it's different for all plants. A bit of understanding of how they grow really helps you with that. Okay, and then where we are putting on a lot of water is undercover. Sure, there's no option there. I do have 2 spray lines there. They're not brilliant. I don't think spray lines ever are. I prefer the overhead watering to water all the soil. That maintains stronger microbial life in my view compared to drip lines, which make the soil moisture only in a small area. And with drip lines, you're restricted to 1 planting per every time you lay them out, and we're often doing successive plantings. You know, that's, for me, I would never use drip lines. I found it more efficient actually to water by hand for what we're doing. So have a look at that one. You know, I'm not saying that's right in all situations, but don't assume you have to have irrigation system. The spray lines help. Then we top up where they haven't gone, because they only do about 2/3 of the area if you're lucky, and like the edges don't get watered. So we know where those dry areas now, and we do the rest by hand. Another nice interplant, the garlic goes in between autumn salads, and then it finally crops early June. We put the annual compost on in May undercover, slightly different to the normal autumn application, because in the polytunnel we can't do that because we've got salads growing very quickly in autumn. But the garlic is amazing, and undercover, if you struggle with rust this year, which I suspect, I know we did here, you get a lot less undercover. It's worth looking at. You get twice the size garlic. Okay. Transplanting using strings, that's a nice way of saving time. So the string with a knot on the end, you can see pretty much how we do it. The root ball on top of the string, which is curling up. This is something you cannot use natural string for. Don't use jute. Obviously, it will rot in the hole, and then your plant will collapse. That needs to be in for the whole year. And then the strings we tie to the top wire. There's Edward planting some cucumbers, for example. The strings are loose at that point until we tie them tighter. Okay. So these lovely photos are to illustrate my point about fertilizers and feedings. I'm not feeding my tomatoes or cucumbers or anything in the tunnel. One thing I will apply though is seaweed. I don't call that a feed or fertilizer, more a, what should we say, health giver. And I'd put rock dust a bit in that category, although I'm not convinced it's so effective as seaweed actually. Seaweed is something I'd love to have more access to, so I'd be using dried seaweed, for example. There's a guy called Instagram, betterplants.ie in Ireland, and he sent me a sample. I really like what he's doing because it's very green. It's not like maxi crop black. I think they get theirs too hot. You know, there's a whole science behind how you process your seaweed to turn it into a saleable product. Okay. And then after the summer crops come out, which is early October usually, tomatoes, for example, we're pinching out the tops now, so they can't make any new trusses, and that helps them to finish and not have too much green fruit on by early October. And that means we're getting them out without too much wastage of any crop in time to get these plants in the ground. They're all sown in the middle of September. This is a key sowing time for salads undercover, mid-September. And these crop from late November through all winter. Okay. Outdoors, well, we're growing some plants undercover. This is a bit about pest protection, where last year we was occasionally getting rabbits, and my most valuable crop is lettuce. So if I'm ever thinking there's going to be a rabbit, I'll cover the new plantings of lettuce, because they're the ones that you can lose so many of in a night. Whereas once they get bigger, you've got a chance to do something if you see damage. So I like to get these covers off if I'm not seeing damage. So we're using covers very selectively and very quickly. 4mm galvanized high tensile wires. You can buy them from a website that's got a link to it on my website, Perennial. And they're 2.5 meters long. That's enough to span most beds, and they're very quick to put in and take out, and keeping out any light. And the netting is veggie mesh or perma mesh netting. It's the most fine one. We'll also keep out flea beetles, for example, using it on wild rocket right the way through spring and summer. Okay. And here's a way to secure the covers. Yeah, there's another mention for the steel supply. Actually, Ready Fast, they sell these hoops. If in winter you're worried about covers blowing off, because I cover spring cabbage and spring cauliflower, again against pigeons, mesh is so useful for that. It ticks all boxes. It keeps a bit of the wind off as well. And if you put a loop over another wire over the top of the first wire, push it in firmly, that helps to secure your cover in high wind conditions down the Sid Valley, for example. Okay. Multisowing, beautiful method, and coming to understand how is it so effective. Seedlings love to go in the ground with their mates. You know, it's a kind of companion planting. And if you look on my website, there's a page just called Multisowing. It gives you just a list of things I recommend to multisow and the numbers of seeds to put in a cell, the kind of number of plants you want in a clump to go in the ground all together, no thinning out. Once you've got your desired number, you might want to thin them up a little bit when they're seedlings. Okay. And so here's a high number one, which is spring onions. We sow 10 spring onions in a cell. We'll be doing that quite soon, actually. In 10 days' time is a brilliant time for sowing white Lisbon spring onions to overwinter and harvest next spring. They don't need protection, probably not even from pigeons, maybe rabbits. And next to them, there where we planted them, you can see small seedlings. We put things in small, is leeks, which grow in smaller number between 2 and 4. I find they work well multi-sown as well. Okay. Yeah, just a quick word on seed, because biodiversity, you know, how is seed produced? Well, it's produced in monocropping fields. So in this case, it will be beetroot, probably in northern Italy, as far as I can tell. So the seed companies contract out their seed production to farmers, and they give them a brief, but they're not paying them enough or checking that they're doing it well. So the farmers are sowing their, say in this case, it would be Boltardi seed in spring or early summer. Then they should be going through that field in the winter before they regrow to rogue out the off types, the fat pink ones, the wizened little ones, the ones that are normal sized beetroot but have got great fat leaves like chard. If you've noticed any of those symptoms on your beetroot, that's from bad seed maintenance, bad varietal maintenance. And one answer to it I found is to save your own seed, but it takes time and effort. So with beetroot, as an example of a vegetable, you can't just have one plant. You need cross-pollination to have a strong gene pool. Otherwise they get inbred and weak. So there I'd done 8. One of them blew down, unfortunately, for it. So we ended up with 7 flowering. And yeah, it was a huge success. And I could say more about seed saving. There's a lot about it actually in my new book, No Dig, coming out in a couple of weeks, where for each vegetable I'll list options for saving seed. Otherwise, look at Real Seed's website. I think the next picture might show you the success of this, that with beetroot harvest. Yeah, that's the beetroot harvest from one plant of Boltardi beetroot. Give you an idea of quantity. It was sort of half a bucket. So, you know, you're going to have plenty of seed. And actually, I gave some to Bristol Seed Swap, and by chance happened to meet a guy just recently who got some from there, and he said, yeah, it was really good. So somehow I'd managed to improve the Boltardi within 1 year, but I think that was a bit of luck actually. And it takes a while to get these old varieties back. And it's one reason I'll sometimes use F1 hybrids, because the old varieties have not been looked after. Early purple sprouting or late purple sprouting, open pollinated, for me, they really go downhill every year. And I just despaired of growing successful purple sprouting broccoli until I found Claret F1, which for me now is default. Fantastic cropping. You know, okay, that's worth just a few F1 hybrid seeds. Okay, next picture. Oh, it turns out that was the last picture. So there we are. I hope you've enjoyed that. Oh, I think
over to you, Stefan, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah. I've just unmuted myself as I started to speak. Thank you very much, Charles. Shall we go to a few questions just in the next few minutes? I know, John, did you have a question? I think quite a controversial one, possibly.
Again, I don't want to be super selfish, but I'll start the ball rolling. I've just been reading George Monbiot's Regenesis, and he again is like you and I. We're probably seem to be about 90% aligned. Is there anything from Monbiot that you'd be wary of?
Yes.
No.
Well, to be honest, I've not read that book, but from what people have told me, you know, and that whole thing of what I was saying about the regenerative farming world, there's not many gardeners in that. And I think they're being too heavily influenced by the big farmers, the big landowners. I've noticed that in the organic movement in the 1980s. It was the big landowners whose who squeezed out the Organic Growers Association, British Organic Farmers and the Soil Association, and we were sidelined. You know, we don't have a big economic voice and that kind of thing. As I said at the beginning, gardening's different. So all this cover, you know, having a plant in the ground all the time doesn't apply. But I've given you lots of clues there how you can grow vegetables right the way through the growing season. That's how I do it. George Monbiot, I've met him. I know him. He's a nice guy. He's not a gardener.
Yeah, thanks. Nice one, Charles.
Okay.
I've got a question, Charles, before we throw it on to the rest. Slugs. How about slug pubs? Have you had any success with those?
Yeah, I do resent the beer though.
We could use flour, yeast and water, I'm told.
Yeah, no, you can. Sure. I just very rarely find the need for it. Where I get slugs, when I can relate to anyone in this situation, is where I've got sluggy zones around the cropping area, or where I've been careless and like I'd left a pile of netting near some beds, and a lot of snails in there. I was really surprised, and then I lost quite a few plants. So it's keeping it tidy for me. And I actually never get around to using a slug pump, but what I will do, my preferred method, I know it's not for everybody, I'll go out with a torch and a knife. You could go out with a torch and a bucket, but just to reduce the population. It's similar to a slug pump, really, reducing numbers.
Yeah, may I request the participants just put your hand up, use the raise hand feature down the bottom if you'd like to ask a question, please. Cool. Alison, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, Charles, thank you very much. I've got a question about my compost bins. I've been living at my new home in Devon for about 18 months, and we have a meadow where the compost bins are. And what I've found is I've got grass snakes that like to live in my compost bins and lay their eggs. And I'm really happy with this. It's slightly inconvenient, really, the composting. And they were laying their eggs right into late November. And I'd really like some advice how I can marry my dual desires. One, to keep my grass snakes, but two, to use my compost.
Yeah, okay. Well, you say your dual desires, but I would say in this case, surely your desire is paramount. You're running the garden. The only reason they got a nice compost heap to lay their eggs in is because you've made it, and you've made that compost heap for a purpose. I think don't beat yourself up that you're going to dislodge a grass snake or two. Okay. They've still got somewhere to go. You know, they got your lovely meadow there. You're doing great favor for them. And I think, you know, the whole thing of favoring wildlife, we can all take it too far. You've got to use your compost. And I get grass snakes here. I've got them in my wormery at the moment. And when I take the cover off, I quite often see them. They usually run.
Yeah.
Slow worms as well. But yeah, no, does that make sense? It'd be, you know.
That's great. I've got your permission to be selfish. That's great.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we lost a few in the transfer earlier, so not so many people. Charles, you did mention something else about rock dust just now. Can you elaborate a bit more about rock dust?
Yeah, oh God, that's a fascinating topic. There's a woman who I've worked with quite a bit. God, her name's gone out of my head. She's founded the Scottish Remin, which actually she ended up selling to Agriland, who now taken rock dust into a new realm, I've noticed, because on their website they're calling it regenerative, believe it or not, regenerating soil. But it's misleadingly been called quarry waste. It's basalt rock. It's not actually quarry waste. It's fine stuff, and it should be fine. It needs to be dust, not small granules. When I got interested in it about 15 years ago, and I had a ton bag in my yard, and we were doing bed and breakfast at the time, and it so happened, one of these weird coincidences, a guy came out, and he's from Australia, and he said, I've been doing research on rock dust for 30 years, spreading it on orchards and checking how it might improve or growth or not. He said, actually, it hadn't made a huge difference that they discovered. And he looked at my rock dust and he said, that will benefit your soil in about 100 years. He said it's too granulated, too big lumps. And so hopefully if you get dust, you can get a few minerals from it. But I think it more depends on your microbes in your soil, being able to kind of access them. And what we use just a little bit, put it in compost heaps. I think that's where it has most value. Charcoal as well, same story. So these materials can charge up with microbes. The microbes can charge them and get, in the case of rock dust, the goodness more available. And there's one other thing about rock dust, which is it's paramagnetic. And this is where we get a bit deep water. But paramagnetism is a fascinating thing. I think this is, I hope I'm not going to put any people off here, but it's something that fascinates me. And I'm sure there's something in it. You know, what are Stonehenge and what Avebury, what are they all about? what are the stone towers of Ireland about? Why are they where they are? Why have they got doors halfway up and some doors at ground level? They are tuning forks, energy centers pulling in low frequency energy from the universe. This was discovered by Philip Callahan. He did a PhD on all of this. He was an American scientist in the 1970s and 80s. And there's a book of his called Ancient Visions, Lost Mysteries, or something along those lines. You can get it at great expense because it's gone out of print. You can have a look at it on like Amazon, books and things. Anyway, he had a scale model in there for making your own little energy tower, a clay land pipe alternating layers of rock dust and wood chip, and that sets up some kind of electrical capacitor conductor. I don't really understand that side of it, but I followed his version, and it's in my garden. Do I know if it's having an effect? No, it's really hard to measure all these things, you know, unless you do a fully scientific trial where you had one garden growing exactly the same things with a receiver and one garden growing same things without. You know, I couldn't afford to do that. That's why these are mysteries, some of them, but if you believe it, it makes sense. I'll go with it. It didn't cost hardly anything. What have I got to lose? So I'd urge any of your listeners to check these kinds of things out. You know, what I was saying about science at the beginning, science only knows so much, and mostly science only acknowledges what it can measure. Scientists do not have devices, for example, to measure certain low frequency energies. A lot of the auras of our bodies, for example, I think most of science struggles with that unless they're keeping it quiet. Hope that makes sense.
Got a question from Janet now. Janet, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask. No, nothing from Janet. Well, whilst Janet's trying to get on, I've got another question. I noticed you didn't mention anything about carbon and nitrogen rates, ratios. And I've always had my doubts about it, but what are your views in terms of compost?
Well, I mean, I agree with it, but I think it's too complicated a way of looking at this issue. I mean, how can anybody look at any materials that we're putting in a compost heap and know how much carbon and how much nitrogen is in there? Because you're given them that ratio, it needs to be 32 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And when you get into that realm of detail and complexity, I think that puts most people off making compost. You know, they'll feel, I can't do that, I'll fail, which you won't. So I talk about greens and browns, and does that make sense or answer to your question, Stefan? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, and I thoroughly agree with you. It confuses the hell out of me, you know.
Oh, brilliant.
And I just sort of look at it and think, well, nature sort of decomposes things naturally, so it's going to be sooner or later. So you know, it doesn't. You know, in a woodland, they don't sort of say, "Oh, well, three more green leaves, please, because we get too many brown ones." It's just nature, isn't it? And you get too obsessed with it. I think Janet's there now, so let's get a question.
Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, you talked about seaweed earlier. Do you use comfrey at all, comfrey tea in place of or with your seaweed?
Yeah, well, I don't need it. Seaweed for me is extra to comfrey tea. It's providing things, you know, comfrey has grown in the garden. It's not going to bring in anything from outside that universe. Can't really, it's just coming from your soul. And comfrey tea takes quite a bit of time to make. And for me, it's all about time. I'll do whatever is the quickest way to get the fertility I need to grow my wonderful crops. And basically, I'm finding compost does that. I don't need the comfrey tea, and I don't want to set aside an area of ground to grow comfrey either, because I've noticed how once you've got comfrey, it's there forever. So you've got to be careful of that one on allotments. I feel somebody else is going to take over your allotment at some point, and they might not want comfrey, and they probably won't be able to get rid of it. So that's my issue with comfrey.
I've got no more hands help at the moment, but is anyone else got a question? If they can just raise a hand a minute. No? Well, in that case, I'm going to pull it to a close. Charles, thank you very much, and for your perseverance this evening once again. It's been great. It's been a really valuable evening, but very, very good. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the audience, and particularly to John for organising his end of the Zoom and keeping the slides going, and that has been great. Thank you very much. So, okay, good night.
John. Okay,
Thanks.
good evening.